You learned in school that U.S. government borrows money from investors, foreign countries, pension funds, wealthy individuals. The Treasury issues bonds, buyers hand over their cash, the government pays them back with interest. Simple, clean, honest. Except the full story looks different. Since 2008, the largest single buyer of U.S. government debt has been the U.S. government itself. The Federal Reserve, an institution created by Congress, now holds $4.5 trillion in Treasury bonds. This represents roughly 15% of all outstanding federal debt. The government issues the debt. The Federal Reserve buys the debt. The Fed earns interest on the debt. Then, the Fed sends most of the interest back to the Treasury. The money goes in a circle. This is not about politicians being irresponsible with your tax dollars. This is about structural engineering at the highest level of monetary architecture. The Federal Reserve sits at the bottleneck of American finance. Every dollar flows through systems it controls. Every interest rate moves at its command. Every major bank operates under its supervision. The Treasury and the Fed built an infrastructure of circular financing over 110 years. They created a machinery of debt absorption and interest extraction. The result? The U.S. government gained the ability to finance itself through its own central bank while maintaining the appearance of market-based borrowing. Other nations tried this openly. They experienced hyperinflation, currency collapse, economic ruin. The United States engineered a more sophisticated system, one with intermediaries, delays, technical procedures, and legal distinctions. The outcome looks different. The math works out the same. Welcome to Noob Historian. We follow the money, trace the power, and expose the history they never taught you in school. This matters to you. Right now, today, your rent, your grocery bill, your retirement savings, your purchasing power. All of it connects to this 110-year-old mechanism. When the Fed buys trillions in government bonds, it creates new dollars. Those dollars enter the economy. Prices rise. Your paycheck buys less. The national debt now exceeds $34 trillion. Annual interest payments surpass $1 trillion. The Fed remitted over $1 trillion back to Treasury between 2010 and 2021. In 2022 and 2023, the Fed began losing money for the first time in its history. The machinery is creaking, the circle is straining, and you are standing inside it. December 23rd, 1913. Most members of Congress had already left Washington for the Christmas holiday. President Woodrow Wilson sat in the Oval Office and signed the Federal Reserve Act into law. The United States of America created a central bank. The official story tells you the Fed exists to prevent bank panics, to stabilize the financial system, to maintain the value of the dollar. The documented history reveals something more specific. The 1913 legislation gave the Federal Reserve authority to conduct open market operations. This meant the Fed gained power to buy and sell government bonds, Treasury securities, the debt of the United States government. From day one, the machinery existed. The legal framework was in place. The mechanism waited for activation. But the men who built this system understood something critical. They knew direct, visible central bank financing of government debt destroyed currencies. They witnessed it in Germany after World War I. They observed it in various Latin American nations. They studied the historical wreckage, so they built intermediaries into the system. The Fed does not buy bonds directly from the Treasury at auction. It buys bonds from primary dealers. These are roughly 24 large banks and financial institutions authorized to trade directly with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Here is how the money flows. The Treasury announces a bond auction. Primary dealers buy the bonds. Days, weeks, or months later, the Federal Reserve buys those same bonds from the primary dealers. The dealers earn a small profit. The Fed earns interest on the bonds. At the end of each year, the Fed remits most of its earnings back to the Treasury. The government pays itself. The primary dealer system creates a gap, a delay, a layer of separation. It transforms direct debt monetization into indirect debt monetization. Legal, technical, deniable. The Federal Reserve archives contain the original documents from 1913 and 1914. The meeting minutes of the first Federal Reserve Board members reveal their awareness of this mechanism. They discussed it openly among themselves. They understood what they were building. They built it anyway. The architecture was complete. The gatekeepers were positioned. The flow of money now moved through channels controlled by a single institution. The Fed became the pressure point in American finance. Every major financial decision passed through its hands. This was not an accident. This was engineered. April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany and entered World War I. Wars cost money, enormous sums of money. The U.S. government needed to raise billions of dollars fast. Tax increases alone would not cover the expense. The Treasury launched a massive bond-selling campaign, Liberty Bonds. Posters appeared across America featuring patriotic imagery. Movie stars toured the country urging citizens to buy. Schools organized bond drives. Communities competed to meet quotas. The official narrative celebrates this as democratic financing of the war effort, citizens lending their savings to their government. The Treasury records tell a more complex story. Commercial banks purchased enormous quantities of Liberty bonds. The Federal Reserve, operating under wartime authority, lent money to these banks at favorable rates. The banks used this borrowed money to buy government bonds. The circle emerged. Fed lends to banks. Banks buy Treasury bonds. Treasury spends the money on war. Treasury pays interest to banks. Banks repay the Fed. The Fed earned interest. The banks earned a spread. The government accessed funds beyond what direct taxation and genuine citizen savings provided. Between 1917 and 1919, federal debt exploded from $3 billion to $27 billion, a nine-fold increase in 2 years. After the war, prices rose. Inflation hit. The cost of living increased 15 to 20%. Workers' wages failed to keep pace. Strikes erupted across the country. The money creation had consequences, but the lesson Washington learned was not about avoiding debt monetization. The lesson was simpler. This works in emergencies. The 1920s brought a period of relative restraint. The federal government ran budget surpluses. Debt declined. The Fed's balance sheet stabilized. Then came the Great Depression. Then came another war. The machinery remained in place, waiting. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. America entered World War II. The Treasury faced the same challenge as 1917, multiplied many times over. The U.S. government needed to finance the largest military mobilization in human history. This time, the Fed dropped all pretense of market-based interest rates. In April 1942, the Federal Reserve and Treasury reached an explicit agreement. The Fed would peg interest rates on Treasury securities at fixed levels, 3-month bills at 0.375%, long-term bonds at 2.5%. This meant one thing. The Fed would buy unlimited quantities of Treasury bonds to maintain these rates. If private investors refused to buy bonds at 2.5%, the Fed stepped in. If market conditions pushed rates higher, the Fed absorbed supply until rates fell back. The Fed became the buyer of last resort, the unlimited buyer. The Fed's balance sheet swelled. Treasury holdings expanded. Federal debt rose from $49 billion in 1941 to $269 billion by 1946. The money supply expanded even faster. The monetary base more than tripled during the war years. But here's the part the history books often omit. This arrangement did not end when the war ended. Treasury Secretary John Snyder wanted to maintain low rates. The federal government had accumulated massive debts. Low interest rates meant low interest payments. Snyder pressured the Fed to continue the peg. For 6 years after World War II ended, the Federal Reserve continued to suppress interest rates on government bonds. 6 years of indirect debt monetization. 6 years of the Fed buying Treasury securities to maintain artificial rate ceilings. Prices rose. The Consumer Price Index climbed 33% between 1945 and 1948. American consumers watched their purchasing power erode. The Fed faced a choice: serve the Treasury's financing needs or fight inflation. The internal tension mounted. Fed governors began to resist. Private complaints turned into public disagreements. The conflict built toward a confrontation. By 1950, the Korean War added new spending pressures. The Treasury demanded continued rate support. The Fed demanded freedom to raise rates. President Truman summoned the entire Federal Open Market Committee to the White House. He pressured them to maintain low rates. He argued national security required cheap government financing. Fed Chairman Thomas McCabe resisted. The standoff lasted weeks. March 4th, 1951. The Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve issued a joint announcement, the Treasury-Fed Accord. Official history celebrates this as the moment the Federal Reserve gained its independence, the end of wartime rate pegging, the birth of modern monetary policy. The original documents tell a different story. The Accord's text is brief. It states the Treasury and Fed reached full accord on debt management and monetary policies. It announces no specific policy changes, no detailed framework, no binding restrictions. The declassified meeting minutes from February and early March 1951 reveal weeks of intense negotiation. The final agreement was a compromise. The Fed gained freedom to allow short-term interest rates to rise modestly. The Treasury gained assurances the Fed would avoid actions disrupting the government bond market. Here is what the Accord did not do. It did not prohibit the Fed from buying Treasury securities. It did not prevent the Fed from conducting open market operations in government bonds. It did not eliminate the primary dealer system. It did not block future coordination between Treasury debt issuance and Fed monetary policy. The Accord redefined the relationship. It did not end it. Between 1951 and 2008, the Fed continued to hold Treasury securities on its balance sheet. The quantities remained modest by later standards, tens of billions, not trillions. The Fed's role as Treasury buyer stayed in the background. The machinery sat dormant. The infrastructure remained intact. The legal authorities persisted. The primary dealer system continued operations. For 57 years, the bond trick operated at low intensity, small scale, quiet, unnoticed by most Americans. Then came September 2008, September 15th, 2008. Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy, the largest bankruptcy in American history. Credit markets froze. Banks stopped lending to each other. The financial system approached collapse. The Federal Reserve responded with unprecedented action. Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke studied the Great Depression as an academic economist. He wrote scholarly papers arguing the Fed made critical errors in the 1930s by not expanding the money supply aggressively enough. Now he held power to test his theories. The Fed cut interest rates to zero. It was not enough. Financial conditions continued to deteriorate. So the Fed turned to a tool it had rarely used at scale since World War II, direct purchases of Treasury securities and other financial assets. They called it quantitative easing, QE. Between November 2008 and June 2010, the Fed purchased $300 billion in Treasury securities, plus $1.25 trillion in mortgage-backed securities, plus $175 billion in agency debt. Then came QE2, another $600 billion in Treasury purchases between November 2010 and June 2011. Then QE3, open-ended purchases of $85 billion per month starting in September 2012. The Fed's balance sheet grew from $900 billion in 2007 to $4.5 trillion by 2015. During this period, the federal government ran massive budget deficits, $1.4 trillion in fiscal year 2009, $1.3 trillion in 2010, $1.3 trillion in 2011, $1.1 trillion in 2012. The Treasury issued bonds. The Fed bought bonds. The FOMC transcripts from these years are now public, released after the mandatory 5-year delay. They reveal candid conversations among Fed governors. In the December 2008 meeting, Vice Chairman Donald Cohn stated the Fed's purchases would reduce Treasury borrowing costs. He acknowledged this had fiscal implications. In the November 2010 meeting, Governor Kevin Warsh expressed concern about fiscal dominance. He worried the Fed was becoming too intertwined with Treasury financing needs. In the September 2012 meeting, multiple governors discussed how QE3 would ease government financing conditions at a time of trillion-dollar deficits. They understood what they were doing. The transcripts document it. The Fed remitted $79.6 billion to Treasury in 2010, $75.4 billion in 2011, $88.4 billion in 2012. The interest the Fed earned on Treasury bonds flowed back to Treasury coffers. The concentration of Treasury debt on the Fed's balance sheet reached levels not seen since the 1940s. The extraction of interest payments and their return to government continued year after year. The bond trick was back, bigger than at any point in American history. The official language described these actions as monetary policy, stimulating the economy, supporting employment, maintaining price stability. The documented effect was fiscal. The U.S. government financed trillion-dollar deficits at interest rates below inflation, negative real rates, free money. Between 2010 and 2021, the Fed remitted over $1 trillion to the Treasury, $1 trillion in interest payments flowing in a circle. March 2020, Congress passed the CARES Act, $2.2 trillion in emergency spending. Then more spending packages followed. The American Rescue Plan added another $1.9 trillion. The Treasury needed to borrow faster than at any point in American history. The Fed responded by buying Treasury securities at a pace never seen before. Not in World War I, not in World War II, not in 2008. The Fed increased its Treasury holdings from approximately $2.5 trillion to $5.8 trillion, a $3.3 trillion increase in 24 months. March 2020, Treasury announces record bond issuance. Fed announces unlimited QE, no cap on purchases. April 2020, Fed buys $300 billion in Treasuries in a single month. May through December 2020, Fed purchases continue at $80 billion per month. 2021, purchases continue throughout the year. March 2022, Fed finally announces it will begin reducing purchases. The correlation between Treasury issuance and Fed absorption was near perfect. The government issued bonds. The Fed absorbed them. During these 2 years, money earned on Treasury bonds sent back to Treasury. The circle spun faster than ever. Consumer prices rose. The inflation rate exceeded 9% by June 2022, the highest in 4 decades. The Fed reversed course. It raised interest rates from near zero to over 5% in less than 18 months, the most aggressive rate hiking cycle since the early 1980s. The Fed holds $4.5 trillion in Treasury bonds purchased when interest rates were low. Now rates are high. The market value of those bonds has fallen. The Fed pays banks more in interest on reserves than it earns on its Treasury holdings. For the first time in its 110-year history, the Federal Reserve is losing money. The Fed's 2023 annual report reveals the creation of a deferred asset. This is an accounting mechanism. When the Fed loses money, it does not show negative equity on its balance sheet. Instead, it creates this deferred asset, a promise to pay itself back from future profits. The deferred asset reached $114 billion by late 2023, growing every week. The Fed now owes itself over $100 billion. It will not remit money to Treasury until it works off this loss. The circle has reversed, at least temporarily. Annual interest payments on this debt surpassed $1 trillion in 2024, more than the defense budget, more than Medicare. Interest costs now consume approximately 17% of all federal tax revenue. This percentage will rise as older, lower-rate debt matures and gets refinanced at current higher rates. The average interest rate on federal debt is approximately 3.3%. The current rate on new 10-year Treasury bonds is approximately 4.5%. As old debt matures and new debt is issued, the average rate climbs. Interest costs compound. By 2030, according to Congressional Budget Office projections, annual interest payments will exceed $1.6 trillion. By 2034, they approach $2 trillion. This creates a pressure point. Option 1, reduce spending or increase taxes to pay the interest. This is politically difficult. Neither party embraces austerity. Option 2, default on the debt. This is economically catastrophic. It would crash the global financial system built on the assumption of U.S. Treasury safety. Option 3, reactivate the bond trick at greater scale. The third option has a name in economic literature, debt monetization, or in modern terminology, expanded quantitative easing. The Fed will buy the bonds. The Fed will create the dollars. The Fed will return interest payments to Treasury. The circle will spin again. This is not speculation. This is pattern recognition. Every time the U.S. government faced a financing crisis over the past 110 years, the Fed expanded its balance sheet. World War I, World War II, the 2008 financial crisis, the 2020 pandemic. Each episode was described as temporary, emergency, extraordinary. Each time, the Fed's balance sheet failed to return to previous levels. The new floor became higher than the old ceiling. In 1913, the Fed's balance sheet was zero. In 1945, it reached $45 billion. In 2015, it reached $4.5 trillion. Today, it remains above $7 trillion despite quantitative tightening. This is what it means for you. The dollars in your bank account, the dollars in your retirement fund, the dollars you earn from your labor. Each will purchase less over time, not because of market forces, because of policy choices made in Washington and New York. This is not conspiracy. The documents are public. The data is published weekly in the Fed's H4.1 statistical release. The FOMC transcripts become available after 5 years. Congressional Research Service reports analyze the mechanisms in detail. The information exists. It sits in plain sight. Few look at it. The bond trick works because it is technical, boring, complicated. It involves acronyms and accounting rules and legal distinctions. But strip away the complexity and a simple truth remains. The United States government has built a system where it borrows money, pays interest on borrowed money, and receives most of the interest back. It is circular financing. It is debt monetization with extra steps. It is the bond trick. And it has operated for 110 years. No monetary system lasts forever. No currency maintains its value indefinitely. No debt accumulation proceeds without consequence. The Roman denarius, the Dutch guilder, the US dollar has held reserve currency status since 1944. 80 years. China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Brazil explore alternatives to dollar-denominated trade. Central banks diversify reserves into gold. These shifts happen slowly and quickly. Your economic future all depend on institutions most people do not understand. Now you understand them better. The Federal Reserve is not a neutral technocratic institution managing the money supply for the public good. It is a mechanism for government financing embedded in the architecture of American monetary policy since 1913. The Treasury does not borrow from the market in a pure competitive process. It issues debt, knowing the Fed stands ready to absorb supply when necessary. The interest on the national debt is not simply a cost of government. A significant portion flows in circles, from Treasury to Fed bond holdings to Fed remittances back to Treasury. This is the bond trick. This is the history they never taught you in school.